Okay, so I'll just walk through that again. It's already a smart object, and I'm using this layer because it's on top of a series of other layers, and it's one of the unaffected layers. Right now it's at 50% opacity. See what it looks like overall. And I'll just work with it at the 100% and then dial it back. So I realize that things may seem a little bit overexposed, but I'm going to dial that layer back anyway. So this is a kind of an unaffected straight rendering from Rhino that's over all the other layers. Okay, so I'll go into Filter, Render, and Lighting Effects. Okay, and so there are a series of different kinds of lighting effects, and this panel should pop up for you. There's a spotlight, there's a point light, and an infinite light. The point light is just that. It's a point of light in space. So you can see how it's affecting. I'm going to dial back the intensity on that. So you can, and this is a little bit, again, it's a preview, so it's not quite rendered into that layer. So just trying to tell you the best it can quickly what that lighting effect might turn out to be. So there's a point light there. You can change the intensity. You can also change the tonality of it. In this case, I have a kind of a warmer, sort of goldish tone, but you could pick any number of tones that you'd like if you want to cool it down or what have you. I'm going to stick with that warm tone. That's the symbol for it there. And I haven't played around with the glossiness or those too much. Just use it for really subtle accent. So I'm actually going to go to the spotlight. And this is a little bit different. This is more so like a light that's going to wash up on a surface, right? And so I can, the point light, I can just move it around and change the intensity. This, I have a little bit more control, so I can change the scale of it. So I'm just grabbing on these grips, and it's going to tell you what kind of modification is going to take place. I can rotate it. So in this case, for this scene, I want it to wash up on this surface. I want it to broaden that out, so I'm going to scale the width up a little bit. Maybe dial it back. I wanted to catch a little. I didn't want this to be totally dark in the background. You can dial up or down the hot spot. So in any light, it's typically going to have a hot spot. So you can manipulate that. Also, I could change the tone, the color tone of it. And again, I haven't gotten into glossiness or metallic. So those are basically the settings that I've been working with. So I'll work with something like that. I'll hit OK. And now it's going to render it into that layer. And now I want to dial it back in terms of its opacity. I was at around 50% before. So you can see it just added a little bit more depth to it just on that front edge. So that's something to work with. I'm going to turn that, I'm going to delete this older one. And I'll just show you, well, maybe it'll be better showing you on a different image. Okay, this is somewhat of a night shot that I put together. So you can see these lights are coming out of Rhino, washing up on that surface. I still have that that light layer on it to kind of warm this area up a little bit, although I dialed it back. And perhaps let's just see, there's that lighting effects. You can see the effect then of the infinite light. Let's see, it's a render, lighting effects. And this one, you know, I think you can bring in three-dimensional objects or 3D virtual models into Photoshop as well, and perhaps this works better with that. But you can see basically here I'm changing the position with this toggle of what would be essentially like the sun. Just dial that up a little bit. So you can start to see how it affects the scene from different points of view. And again, you can give it a different tone. It's just lighting everything up overall. And you can start to manipulate three-dimensionally. I have a feeling that this works better with a three-dimensional object in Photoshop. But essentially it's trying to simulate a sun. I'm going to cancel that. The other thing that I did with this night scene, everything else is pretty much the same. What's different with this scene, first is the background, the sky. I just darkened the sky, so I just used a simple brightness contrast darkening. So I just darkened that down. There's a few ways you could do that. I could go down to the sky here, select it. There's already a motion blur on it, and I can add a layer over that that's going to be brightness and contrast. Also hue and saturation, which also includes a lightness, so I could darken it there. Essentially what that's going to do, if I go back to layers, is add an overall modification layer, an adjustment layer here they call it. So that's going to again affect everything that's beneath it in that overall layer sequence, and so I can start to manipulate it there to darken the sky. I'm going to remove that. The other thing that I did was I went ahead and rendered this in Rhino with those lights shining up. So it washed up against the context in the background, but I went through the same steps in terms of rendering the main intervention by itself, and also then contextually with the surrounding buildings. And then really just to mark potential lighting objects in that overall space. Here I had some poles, essentially they meant to be lighting street poles that were there. They're actually Rhino lighting light objects up there, but it's just a simple cylinder. This is just a tapered cylinder with a surface at the top, a square surface at the top. So it looks a little peculiar there, so just to kind of polish the rendering, just added a light, and the technique for that is really very simple. I just used the foreground color being white. Then I used the brush tool, made sure the brush tool is at a good size, made sure it was soft, and then I could add a light anywhere I'd like. So here, lights on the end. So it's just a way to kind of give the overall image a little bit more depth. Again, I'm not trying to reach for a photorealism here, just to really have the reading or the experience of the overall spatial composition to start coming through. So those are just a few things that I wanted to show you. I'm not it's not a requirement or anything, but is there anyone that wanted to know more about the Rhino lights themselves and how to use them? Or attempt a night scene, which can be a little bit difficult? So I'm just going to launch Rhino here. And again, I think it's a little bit different. Again, typically I use Flamingo as the plugin, and it's a Rhinoceros or McNeil and Associates plugin for Rhino. It's not the best, but working with it in then Photoshop this way allows it to, I think, be decent enough to use for a project. There are other plugins like V-Ray that handles light really well and materials really well, and there are a few others, but the main ones that I've seen used are V-Ray and Flamingo. And Flamingo's pretty affordable as well. So what we're looking at here is the Rhino file. And we're gonna zoom in on this, and you can see actually what I've created here. There are a series of layers to this as a lighting object. One is this little trough, which I actually created for a different project, and I just migrated over for this project. And I can scale it up and down just like any other object, but part of it, and it's grouped with something else, is this cylinder that you see on the inside of it. That's the actual light. So that's the light itself. But I had created this trough because I wanted to at least try to throw the light in a particular direction, and also it was meant to depict at least somewhat an actual fixture that I would specify for the project, which was similar in scale to this. So if we go into, let's see, render. So under the render tools, we have a series of different lighting options here. Create a spotlight, point light, create a directional light, which again is a little bit more like simulating the sun, a rectangular light, a linear light. Okay, those are the main ones. I haven't really used these others too much, but they work similarly. This case I was using a linear light. So I'm just going to go, I selected that, I'm going to go in my top view. And basically I'm just going to draw a line. If you look really close, I know it's hard because it's green. It's creating that tube already. It's just below the ground plane in this case, so I'm going to have to move it up. Okay, there it is. So here's a linear light source, and I have it selected, and so like any other object, I can then go to the sidebar and start to look at some of the properties of it. So I can look at the layer of it, I can see, you know, kind of where it is with respect to similar characteristics to other simple objects. But you can see here there are these other toggles. Once I go from layers to properties, which is this spectrum color circle here, the object is telling me what layer it's on, you know, all those conditions that are related to objects, line type, color, that sort of thing. There's also material, so you could adjust the material by object, but again, I recommend that you guys work with materials by layer, similar to how I showed you last week. And then there's another option that's specific to this object, which is a light properties. So I can select the light properties, and here I can select the color of that light. So maybe I'll go for a gold. I can turn the light on or off. I can toggle the intensity of that light, also the shadow intensity of that light. So with these simple, and this is going to be trial and error with doing quick renderings as tests, so kind of sketch renderings to see the effects of this light source now that it has on the rest of the intervention and the context. So I'm going to guess 25%, maybe the shadow intensity, I want it to be 50%, and see how that works. And so in order to do that, I'd have to get into the view, of course, that I wanted to use. This is out of the view that I was working with before. Actually, let me just, for the sake of this, delete those, and I'll move this into place. So I don't have that little trough anymore, so the light's actually going to go through the bottom. So I'll turn on, I have a vegetation layer. And then just start doing some preview renders. Again, you shouldn't have this come up with, this is because I was using Flamingo. So I'll just hit continue. And then through this, you know, with small renders, again, you could set the rendering window to be really small. So this will run a lot quicker. So already we can see we have some problems with this quick render. First of all, the sun is still on. So I have to turn the sun off. Toggle the sun off. And then I can do another quick render. So I can see because of the tonality that it's somewhat coming through, although it's not really giving me the effects that I wanted. I'm just going to move it up inside of that cage and see what it does. So this is going to be, again, trial and error, and this takes a little bit of time. That's why, you know, in terms of really setting up lights and getting this involved with the renderer, can be time consuming. So you have to really think about whether you want to attempt something like this, or at least perhaps reserve it for something that you could simulate in Photoshop. So I don't think that light is working. Everything is just washed out. I can see a little bit of shadow down there. Let me I'm going to open this up again. Ghosting. I'm just going to go back and turn off the light. I'm just seeing if there was something else wrong with that file. Off the sun. So well, skylight was still on. I think that's what it was. So that's not really coming through with the lighting effects that I anticipated. I'm going to try it with this one. Lights are on. In this case, these lights are working. You can see it's just really washing out that underside. So they'd have to be dialed down in their intensity. And then I'm going to bump up the intensity here just to see if it's set too low. So you can just see by trial and error, this starts to accumulate a little bit of time. Playing with the intensity, you can see that was the issue before where I wasn't really working. So I toggled that, this still isn't quite right, and so you have to move it, do a quick render again, like trial and error until you really had the reading you want. You can start to see some shadows coming through on that surface there. There are also spotlights. So let's try to shine a spotlight on the object. Okay, so I mean basically the steps where I just took that tool, create a spotlight. I wanted to place it in the plan in a specific position, so that's why I started on the top view. And then this is giving the radius for the spread. And you can see here we're drawing then back the cone of light that eventually where the actual light will be positioned and the cone of light that it'll cast. So that's why I went and jumped into the side view so I can put it at an angle. And then I just moved it up into position so it would wash on that object. So it's really shining through. It's a little bit over. Oops. And I could rotate this just like any other object. So if I wanted to correct that angle, just do that there, nudge it here, maybe pull it back a little bit, get into my right view, and then see what happens. So we can see you have a little hot spot there. There are some shadows there. You can see the shadows are really stark. So that would be going back into the properties and then making some adjustments to the properties of those lights and making sure it was what you were intending it to be. So I could maybe dial down the shadows 70%, just touch the intensity down a bit and try it again. So it's kind of highlighting the areas. You can see, I can see with this rendering technique already, most likely what I would start doing, because the context is sort of self-illuminating. I think that's just part of Rhino render. So I would most likely render this scene without the intervention in it, or just assume that I was going to have a layer that's going in Photoshop eventually rendered from here that's just going to be very dark, to make sure to put the background or the context into the background, and again to make sure that the intervention was the element that was being highlighted, and eventually render this without context. Similar to what I did with the day scene. So with that and dialing in the materials, this material isn't quite set. I probably would have that be a little bit more translucent and perhaps lighten this material up a little bit. And so it's kind of tweaking some of those properties until you get the overall reading that you're looking to achieve. One thing that I would recommend for everyone, and this, some of these, renderings, especially with this kind of different technique, I could start to manipulate a lot of this, even the tonality in Photoshop, and so I don't necessarily have to spin my wheels trying to get the perfect rendering out of Rhino. I would actually recommend not to do that. You have your line drawing, you have something that indicates shade and shadow, you have something that's indicating context with those as building blocks, in addition to understanding where eye level is, to add entourage and so forth. You can start to build up the scene without, again, spending too much time trying to get Rhino Render to work. Rhino Render isn't the best rendering engine by any means, right? So you can get basic information from Rhino Render. I guess at this point, with where you guys are, you should have some hand drawings put together for those perspective shots, some layers that you've been working with coming out of Rhino, so you have some drafts, working drafts for Thursday. So I'd like you guys to have a semblance of a Photoshop file that perhaps we can look at a few of them, just see how things are developing and some of the issues that you're having as you're working through these steps. But at this point, are there any questions? Things that have come up as you've been working through this? Okay, so make sure that you're working towards that goal of trying to put the layers together in Photoshop, making sure that there's a particular kind of reading that you're reaching for that makes sense with the conceptual underpinnings of the project that you're working on, and have something to look at, so you're not basically assembling this at the last minute. That's why I have that draft deadline for Thursday, so we can see approximately how the images are developing, and you're starting to understand what the workflow is like. A lot of this is just starting to understand and develop an awareness of, I need to modify the drawing and rescan that, or I need to go back into Rhino and make an adjustment and bring it back into Photoshop, or I need to work in Photoshop. Whatever that step might be, that you're starting to develop a kind of workflow to reach these kinds of goals. So make sure that you're putting yourself through the paces going into Thursday, again, so over break and with everything else that you guys have to achieve, that it starts to be a little bit more commonplace. It shouldn't be anything new that you're confronting after that point. So make sure you're hitting that point. We'll be looking for that, and we'll be using the remainder of the time today to walk around and help you guys with setting up some of these scenes and sorting through some of the issues. Okay, well, if there's no questions, then we'll just be coming around. Thanks, guys.